Changes in the landscape occur subtly and over time. But at Ray Nixon Road, south of Fountain, Colorado, the railroad significantly upgraded its infrastructure. The original wooden trestle was replaced by a concrete drainage tunnel, surrounded by landfill. A Wyoming-bound Burlington Northern empty coal train crossed an unpaved Baptist road. The train was en route north through Monument, Colorado in 1987. On the point was a General Motors SD40-2. Burlington Northern owned at least 779 of them. Engine number 7876 was built for the Colorado and Southern Railroad in March 1979. The Colorado and Southern was a Burlington Northern subsidiary until it was merged into the railroad in 1981. Finally, new All-Star aluminum gondolas followed in this train of otherwise steel-built cars. New, lighter-weight aluminum coal cars were introduced during the 1980s. They allowed for increased lading and cubic foot capacity compared to their steel predecessors. Union Pacific C41-8W, number 9404, pulled the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus train across the same Baptist Road grade crossing, just south of Monument. This was the Red Unit circus train. It was loaded over the course of the night after the last show at the Colorado Springs World Arena. Ringling Brothers had two circus trains. The second was the Blue Unit. Finally, a third Gold Unit traveled the highways by truck to those communities not easily accessible by rail. Improvements were being made to the Baptist Road crossing. Note also the crossing gates, new since 1987. Lead Rio Grande SD40T-2, number 5379, was a 3,000 horsepower six-axle diesel locomotive. It was built in January 1977 by General Motors' Electromotive Division. It would eventually be renumbered twice by Rio Grande successor Union Pacific. Later, it was sold to General Electric Capital Leasing as number 8633 in January 2004. Many Union Pacific SD40T-2s spent their last days working as lease units, as exemplified by Sister 2879 in Dalhart, Texas. The 117-year-old Denver and Rio Grande Western rostered a fleet of 73 SD40 T-2s in 1987. These locomotives were commonly referred to as tunnel motors. They were essentially SD40-2 units, modified with their radiator air intake grills located low, along the walkway and toward the back. This design drew in fresher air from below the locomotive's exhaust, while inside a tunnel or snow shed. Commercial and residential growth continued in Palmer Lake over the course of 20 years. Progress was also taking place on the railroad. Notice that concrete cross ties replaced traditional wooden ties. Finally, Union Pacific C40-8, number 9100, in second position behind UP number 9404, was the first C40-8 ever built. Number 9100, manufactured by General Electric in November 1987, was delivered new to the Union Pacific. The C40-8 was one of the first microprocessor-controlled diesel locomotives, introduced during the 1980s. Circuses began using railroads to haul animals and supplies for limited distances during the 1840s. But it was the ingenuity of the P.T. Barnum Circus that first loaded wagons onto flat cars, piggyback style, on April 18, 1872. Piggyback eventually became the standard for hauling truck trailers on flat cars for freight railroads. Rented sleeping cars for the circus crew and performers completed the train, which first operated on the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was also the first unit train, an entire train dedicated to one shipper. Santa Fe switcher GP20, number 3074, was returning home to Denver. This 2,000 horsepower GP20 was built by EMD in December 1961 as Santa Fe 1174, renumbered 3174, and then renumbered again. The 3074 was given its final number after being rebuilt by the Santa Fe in December 1979. No longer assigned to mainline freights, GP20 diesels were often assigned to switching jobs on the Santa Fe during the 1980s. In February 1989, the 3074 was renumbered 2001 for the Toledo, Peoria, and Western, a Midwestern Granger line. There it spent the last years of its career before being scrapped. Just about all of the old industrial buildings that distantly lined the railroad had been removed in Louviers. Also removed since 1987 were the wayside telephone poles and the side track located to the west of the main line. The Barnum and Bailey Greatest Show on Earth toured America for the first time in 1888. On April 7, 1891, master showman Phineas Taylor Barnum died. His partner, James A. Bailey, took control of the show and carried it to new heights. The circus grew to have 5 performance rings. It employed over 1,000 people and traveled on 85 rail cars. On July 8, 1907, the Ringling Brothers of Baraboo, Wisconsin, purchased their largest competitor. The show's name was lengthened to the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. Competition continued to be fierce. The height of rail travel by circuses in the United States reached 32 shows in 1911. County Line Road crossing was a dirt road protected only by crossbucks. Approaching was a Burlington Northern truck trailer train, led by SD 40-2 number 7195. General Motors Electromotive Division introduced the 6-axle SD 40-2 diesel locomotive in January 1972. Almost 4,000 were built through February 1986. The letters SD stood for Super Duty. The 3,000 horsepower SD 40-2 was an upgrade from EMD's SD 40, introduced in 1966. Notable improvements over the SD40 included a modular electronic control system and high-traction wheels and trucks. The SD40-2 had a lower horsepower rating compared to its contemporaries, namely the 3,600 horsepower SD45 and SD45-2. However, the SD40-2 was significantly more economical and reliable. Lower fuel consumption was especially important during the oil crisis of the 1970s. A faster-paced northbound unit coal train, led by Burlington Northern Santa Fe ES44AC number 5868, crossed an upgraded county line road. The road had been paved after 1987 and was protected by flashing lights and gates. On lease to Burlington Northern from leasing company Oakway were 100 6-axle SD60 diesel locomotives. Burlington Northern used them to replace their aging fleet of U-30Cs, which were being retired. The microprocessor-controlled 3,800 horsepower SD60 was introduced by General Motors' Electromotive division in 1984. Burlington Northern was charged per kilowatt hour to lease its 100 SD60s, also known as power by the hour. The cost to rent a locomotive increased when the engine was in use, but decreased while at idle. This concept was new compared to a traditional time-only based lease. Union Pacific Northern Class 484, number 844, continued its trek south through downtown Colorado Springs, pulling the Colorado State Fair Express. Number 844 was built by the American Locomotive Company for Union Pacific in December 1944. Originally designed to burn coal, it was later converted to be an oil burner. It hauled passengers until 1957, when the Union Pacific began assigning new Streamliner diesels to its passenger trains. Hauling freight was then the primary duty assigned to UP 844 until its retirement from regular service in 1959. Saved from being scrapped in 1960, the steam engine was reassigned for special service, such as pulling public excursion trains. The diesel locomotive behind number 844 was SD70 ACE, number 1989. It was originally to be numbered 8521, but was renumbered when it was painted in its unique Rio Grande heritage paint scheme. In the background, from left to right, were the Antlers Hotel and the Holly Sugar Building. Santa Fe Switcher GP39-2, number 3401, continued its work building blocks of freight cars in the downtown rail yard. The 14-story Holly Sugar headquarters opened as the city's tallest building in 1967. In 1988, Holly Sugar was acquired by Imperial Sugar of Sugar Land, Texas. The Holly Sugar offices remained in Colorado Springs until 1997. The Antlers Hotel had been significantly modernized by 1987. The original structure was built at the west end of Pikes Peak Avenue in 1883. It was destroyed by fire in October 1898. A new structure was built, which remained standing until 1964. It was torn down to make room for the Holly Sugar Building and a more modern hotel. Sometime later, the modern Antlers Hotel was refaced. Both Burlington Northern Santa Fe and the Union Pacific Railroad spotted freight cars in the former Rio Grande rail yard. At one time, the Santa Fe had its own rail yard in Colorado Springs, just east of downtown. The Santa Fe line through the city's neighborhoods was heavily burdened with grade crossings. Therefore, in 1971, an agreement was made with the city to remove the tracks that bisected those neighborhoods. By July 1974, The Santa Fe line had been abandoned from as far north as Palmer Lake to as far south as Widefield. Where double track remained, trains were controlled by automatic block signals. On the new single track segment with passing sidings, centralized traffic control was implemented, controlled by a dispatcher. A northbound Public Service Company of Colorado unit coal train passed through the old Rio Grande rail yard on the main line. Note the tall downtown building hard to the left. It was built as the Norwest Bank Tower in 1990. With 15 floors, it surpassed the Holly Sugar Building as the city's tallest. By 2007, it had been renamed the Wells Fargo Tower. One of the many railfan excursions pulled by Union Pacific 844 over the years was the Tennessee Pass Special. The old Denver and Rio Grande line, over the 10,240-foot Tennessee Pass, was going to be closed. The Union Pacific favored the less difficult Moffett Tunnel route as an alternative. Rio Grande SD50 number 5517 led a westbound empty coal train with 2 borrowed Santa Fe SD40-2s past the siding in Granite. The 3,500 horsepower 6-axle SD50 was designed by EMD to replace the popular 3,000 horsepower SD40-2. The Rio Grande planned to purchase 20 new SD40T-2 tunnel motors from EMD in 1984. However, after testing 4 SD50s brought over from the East Coast in March 1984, the Rio Grande decided to purchase 17 of its own from EMD. The SD50 was equipped with a new Super Series wheel slip control that was good for mountain railroading. This train of steel-built hopper cars was owned by the Swindell Dressler Energy Supply Company to serve Northwest Texas. No through trains had operated over the old Rio Grande Tennessee Pass line since August 23, 1997. For more than a decade, the Union Pacific had neither operated nor abandoned the line. The rails remained between Parkdale to the east and Dotsero to the west, but were largely unused. Parkdale was east of Salida on the Royal Gorge segment of the line. No through trains traversed the Royal Gorge route between Pueblo and Salida anymore. However, the line was still active, with rock and rail quarry trains and the Canyon City and Royal Gorge Railroad, a tourist train. On the west end, the Moffat Tunnel route connected to the Tennessee Pass line at Dotsero. Rio Grande Tunnel Motors 5357 and 5382 led a westbound freight through Grande. The train climbed the 1.4% maximum grade toward Tennessee Pass. The ruling grade on the east side of the pass was less than the Moffat Tunnel route's 2% maximum grade. However, it was the 3% grades on the west side of Tennessee Pass that made it a challenge to operate. In 1987, the Rio Grande attempted to move much of its traffic onto the Moffat Tunnel route to save in operating expenses. The Tennessee Pass line was down to 2 regular trains per day, but that would change with the 1988 merger with the Southern Pacific. Although the Rio Grande had considered abandoning the Tennessee Pass line in 1987, it would prove its value under the Southern Pacific flag through the 1990s. With the Moffat Tunnel route operating at capacity, Tennessee Pass became part of Southern Pacific's Central Corridor. Narrow gauge track was laid over Tennessee Pass by the Rio Grande in 1881. More of a branch line off the Royal Gorge route than a mainline railroad, the track stopped at Rock Creek near Red Cliff in 1882. However, a new silver boom in Aspen inspired the Rio Grande to continue building west along the Eagle River in 1886. In 1888, the Rio Grande began to standard gauge its rails west of Pueblo to compete with the Colorado Midland Railroad. Part of this initiative included boring the first tunnel at Tennessee Pass between 1889 and 1890. The original tunnel remained in service until 1945. A new, larger tunnel was then bored through, just west of the old one. Trains from California crossed the Continental Divide at Tennessee Pass en route to Pueblo. Between Pueblo and Kansas City, Missouri, the Southern Pacific had trackage rights over Union Pacific's former Missouri Pacific line. Between Dotsero and Pueblo, heavier rail, new cross ties, and ballast brought Tennessee Pass and the Royal Gorge route back up to modern mainline standards. Clearances were improved to accommodate double-stack container trains. Rio Grande SD-50, number 5517, was built by EMD in September 1984. It was renumbered 9861 by the Union Pacific before being retired in June 2007. It since went to the Southwestern Railroad in Perryton, Texas. The Tennessee Pass line would become obsolete with the September 1996 merger of the Southern Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads. The Union Pacific's overland route through Wyoming provided a viable alternative to the mountainous Tennessee Pass line. One of the most famous places on the Denver-Pueblo route was the Air Force Academy, just north of Colorado Springs. The most distinguished structure at the Air Force Academy was Cadet Chapel, finished in 1962. The 17 airplane wing-shaped aluminum spires were fabricated in Missouri and then shipped to the area by rail. Originally, 19 spires were to be built, but 2 were left off due to budget constraints. The cadet area, including the chapel, was listed as a National Historic Landmark in 2004. The cadets of the class of 1959 chose the Falcon to be the Air Force Academy's sports mascot. Falcon Stadium, an outdoor football stadium, was constructed in 1962. Home games of the Mountain West Conference were played here, and graduation ceremonies took place here each spring. Down at trackside in 1987, a northbound truck-trailer train approached the Northgate Boulevard Bridge. This was one of 2 guarded entryways into the Air Force Academy. The 4th locomotive, B30-7A number 4101, was among 120 3,000 horsepower cabless diesels built by General Electric in 1982 and 1983. Built exclusively for Burlington Northern, they were retired by BNSF by June 2001.